Haruspex is a fictional segment created using real places within the southeastern Virginia region. However, names, characters, businesses, places, events, locales, and incidents are either the products of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons living or dead or actual events is purely coincidental. As well, subjects covered within this story are intended for mature audiences. Viewers' discretion is advised.
A woman's experience with the paranormal turning out to be far different than anyone could have ever intended.
The rat made it all the way climbing onto my chest, where it just sat there staring and staring and staring.
A construction worker digging up the dark secrets of people long forgotten.
I just knew for certain, right there, I wasted an entire night's worth of work. How wrong was I?
A research group's dilemma as one of their members are not seen after their shift.
Before opening the door, I could just feel that there was something rotting in there. I was just hoping it wasn't John.
Join us as we dig deeper to find the truth around us. The story you don't know can be sitting right next to you. From the Marlin Broadcasting Network, this is Haruspex. The search for truth is a journey man has been on for all of history. Its nature has been the subject of talk from thinkers, historians, clergymen, and scientists alike. Can truth really be objective? Or is truth only in the eye of the beholder? Is there actually any truth in the world that we live in? Or is that our purpose for living? To find that truth? Years have been spent delving into this matter, with many schools of thought and beliefs created to find and understand truth. To some, the finding of absolute truth is the reason that humankind exists. To others, absolute truth is the end of civilization as we know it. Will there ever be a solution in this life that satisfies the dilemma of truth? For decades, Virginia Wesleyan University has been one of Hampton Roads' biggest private institutions. Founded in 1961 and opened to students in 1966 under the Methodist Church's guidance, the school is now in its 59th year of existence. Under the tenure of its fourth president of the university, Scott D. Miller, VWU continues to grow in size, with a student body of around 1,600 and status, with the campus continuing to build new facilities and remodel old ones. As the school progresses into the future, it seeks to further the name of the institution, creating a legacy of excellence in academics among its students. However, this advancement also leaves behind parts of history and memories made by the community of the past. There are the important pieces to the university's history that are commemorated in either buildings, books, or short news articles, but those are the stories that they've wanted to keep. The stories that they've hand-chosen for people to read about and remember for years to come. While those stories are ones they want others to know, there are stories that the community needs to remember. My name is Jackson Simmons, and my partner, Robert Jones, and I have set out on a mission to find and rediscover those stories. We are looking to not only provide you with the story, but to truly let you experience the emotions and feelings of those who experienced it. While we want to tell you every story possible, it does not seem fitting to do so without having someone who witnessed it firsthand recount these tales. Each story told tonight and in later segments will be eyewitness accounts from interviews done by Robert and I. Some of these stories can be severely dark, and as stated before, we warn listeners to please use your discretion while listening to these accounts. Before we begin, we would like to mention one thing. This typically would be the part of the program where we would ask you to sit back, relax, and enjoy. But with the intent of our mission, I must ask that you instead listen, feel, and remember these tales, for they are just as much history to Virginia Wesleyan University as the buildings and books around you are. Thank you. I'm certain that almost all of you have heard stories running through campus discussing all the plagues that ail students, whether they be quarrels between roommates piercing the paper-thin walls keeping you up at night, the tears of hallmates furiously attempting to complete a midnight assignment just as it approaches 11:30, or even dealing with the faint smell of that oh-so-familiar Mary Jane passing by. However, particularly with the students residing in Rose Hall, the typical night may be a little more paranormal than those their peers encounter. Rose Hall allegedly has been having multiple reports of unusual sounds and bumps, things occasionally being moved out of place, and sometimes even doors being suddenly closed or opened. It's very rare to have one of these instances occur, yet every now and then, a student will report something unusual happening. Many stories have been proposed to explain what has been the cause of these mysterious events, but none are more popular than the paranormal being simply known as the Rose Hall Ghost, being the one behind everything. While most students are convinced that the Rose Hall Ghost is the one behind the mystery, they don't necessarily believe that the spirit is a malevolent one. In fact, no students have reported any stories detailing any aggressive behavior or malicious intent. As a matter of fact, we have Carmen here with a story that, while certainly unsettling, is actually a positive experience. Carmen Thompson, a biology major with hopes of pursuing a medical degree, approached her first day of college with fear and regret. However, unfortunately, her greatest fears were confirmed.
I still don't really know how to make much sense of all that really happened. All I know is that whatever it was not normal. And it seemed to start when my mom started to get extremely sick. She's always been a pretty sickly person, or so I hear from my dad, but when I was about 9, she fell really ill. And that in itself was a mystery for another day, but not a single useless doctor could tell us what was wrong with her. All they could muster was that every morning they would need to inject her with some substance that no one felt the need to tell me. God, I hated not knowing what was happening. She was my mother too, but it seemed no one cared that I was left in the dark. And so time passed, and eventually I graduated high school and started here at Virginia Wesleyan, against my will, of course. I remember back when I was younger watching my dad struggle to take care of Mom, let alone both of us. I could have stayed and helped. Maybe then she would have gotten better. The only reason I left was because Mom wanted me to. Besides, I couldn't fight both of them on it. That was the worst mistake of my life. It hadn't even been 3 weeks, and suddenly I get a call from my dad. I could tell from his voice immediately something horribly wrong had happened. "Dad, what's wrong?" I asked. And that's the moment I died inside.
Honey, I'm so sorry. Your mother, she's gone. And hear me out before you say anything. I messed up.
I wasn't really listening after that point. He muttered some bullshit about he messed up and the ambulance was too slow. I couldn't take it anymore. I hung up the phone then and there. It was approaching exam time, but there was no way I could sit there and pretend that nothing happened. Everything felt useless. All I could do was sit there and sleep. Little did I know that going to sleep that day would turn into days on end of me laying in bed. I couldn't muster the strength to do anything. My roommate Michaela tried to talk to me for a little, but eventually it seemed she gave up too. Days into weeks had passed, and eventually, weirdest thing happened. One night Michaela was out doing who knows what, but she wasn't in the room. What I did see in her room was an odd-looking rat. As I inspected the room, I noticed that the trash had been piling up in the room. I don't really know how long I was in that room for. Regardless, it explained the rat being there, but being the state I was in, I didn't care. Although, the rat didn't seem to be concerned with the trash. Actually, the rat's eyes were fixed solely on me. It slowly crept over towards me until it made its way onto the bed and climbed up the leg of the frame. And of course, at this point, you think I would try to get up and get away from it, but I don't know, I felt oddly comfortable with this rat. I felt this weird urge to welcome it. The rat made it all the way climbing onto my chest, where it just sat there staring, until suddenly it jumps towards my mouth. Scrambling at this point, the rat forcing its way down my throat, and all I could do is flail around. And the next thing I knew, I'm in a park, on a bench. I look around and there's this woman next to me wearing a white dress. She's shorter than I am, with brunette hair. I can't picture her face though. It was like there was this veil in front of it, so I couldn't make out any distinct facial features. But I could see her mouth, and it seemed like she was smiling almost. I noticed that consistently the area around me was shifting between scenes. Sometimes we're home, or in my dorm, or in the car at my old school, but never in one place for too long. All that was constant was the bench and this weird woman. Suddenly, without turning to me, she, almost like a whisper, she speaks to me.
What is ailing you?
And before I could even open my mouth, the scenery begins to change to my mom's face. At various points in my life, all shuffling between her being healthy and before she died. The woman begins to speak some more, but the entire dream itself is fuzzy. I can't even remember what we were talking about for most of it, but I do recall that her voice was soft yet warm. I felt at peace around her. I couldn't really explain it at the time, but from her presence, it just felt like she understood me, like she knew what I was going through. I was distracted by just her voice and the images flashing around me. Finally, all the images disappeared and the space around us returned to the park scene that we were first at. And she turns to me and she says,
She is at peace, and you will continue on for her sake.
and immediately the scenery began to blur and fade out of existence until I woke back up in my dorm. I felt nauseous as I began to wonder what I had eaten that day, or if I'd eaten that day. Before I could finish my thought, I couldn't hold myself from falling and vomiting right onto the floor. And in this slimy mess of green and brown, I see one solid black mass lying right in it that begins to shift away from me towards the door. As the mass nears the door, it stops and turns and looks at me with its beady red eyes, and it became clear that it was the rat. Without breaking eye contact and seemingly without even moving its legs, the rat kind of just floats out of the room. What was most shocking to me was that everything felt normal. Normal with myself, I mean. I didn't have this heavy feeling on my heart anymore. What I can say for certain, though, is that the events of that night are as far from normal as is possible.
After hearing her story, we talked with her more about the dream. We wanted to find out why she felt there was a connection between them. So the next day, we spent the day digging through old files at the school about situation reports in the past, hoping to find some sort of link between these two. After about 5 hours of searching, we stumbled upon a suicide case in Rose Hall 15 years ago. Take a look at this. Do you think you recognize her?
I think that's her. I don't remember her face, but... That's her! That is definitely her.
case we found was of a girl named Madeline Kleins. In November of 2005, she was found in her room bleeding out after making self-inflicted wounds on her body. In the report, there isn't any info about her school life or if there was any direct reason for her taking her own life. However, a note was found on her desk for her stepmother stating, "I'm sorry. I know that Papa's death wasn't your fault. It was mine for not being with him. This is also not your fault. I have to see Papa. I have to apologize." Cultures have devised a variety of methods to decipher the truth that envelops our world. In the realm of the physical world, the professionals within the scientific and mathematical communities make discoveries that benefit all of humanity and help us thrive on Earth. Research and developments in medicine, agriculture, transportation, architecture, and electronics have been able to shape our world into the place we see it as today. Spiritually based methods have also been practiced for many centuries. The center of all religions and beliefs are fostered from humanity's curiosity in the truth of our origin and purpose. These systems of faith are all unique in their ways of practices and ideologies, but one commonality is that they all have some version of a source of truth that can't be directly accessed or unlocked without the guidance of a figure who acts as connection to the source. In the case of some of the more famous religions, this figure will be your prophets, preachers, rabbis, lamas, swamis, etc. Our focus will be on a certain type of figure that had a significant impact on religions from an earlier point in history. We will be discussing those who practiced divination, who they are, and how two specific types of diviners were significant to us during our time researching, after the conclusion of our next story. Are you familiar with the environmental chamber in the Greer Environmental Sciences building? If you aren't, it may be for the better that you don't know anything about it. I'm sure that the professors would be trying to steer you all away from being near it, let alone knowing anything about it, so I don't blame you all for not knowing about it. Actually, there was a major case about it. In hindsight, I'm fairly shocked that the school was capable of hiding this for as gruesome as it was when it first broke the news. But fortunately, we have a person with insider information to the details of the sheer mess that the first responders could barely make sense of. Bradley Anderson never imagined that when he first had the opportunity to work with the school's new environmental chamber, it would be the last time anyone else would get to.
You know, you never really see it coming when something happens to someone. Everything was as normal as could possibly be the days coming before it happened. It was supposed to be a tiny research project. Apparently in 2016, these crazy bugs called screwworms showed up and immediately started terrorizing the wildlife. What would happen is that the flies that gave birth to the worms would find an open wound, plant their eggs, and not even a day, the eggs would hatch and the larva would tear and feast on the flesh of the host animal. Eventually, after about a week, the larva would grow into flies and collectively fly out of the host animal from the entry wound. In hindsight, I wish that was all we were dealing with here. Only a year later, researchers discovered that there was another species of this worm that were different from the originals. We didn't really know much about them, so Virginia Wesleyan decided that it was a great chance to study them. Find their optimal conditions, mating behaviors, and things like that. I volunteered to help with the research along with some others: Chris, Shannon, Dylan, and John. The most basic part of observing any animal you're doing research on is keeping them in a controlled environment. Luckily, Wesleyan had an environmental chamber where we can do just that. and so obviously we decided to set up the worms in there with the usual stuff that we assumed they would enjoy. A container of soil and compost. Everything seemed fine. We even set up a schedule for each of us to head into the room every now and then to record what we find. I'd go in for a week, then Dylan, then Shannon, then John. Unfortunately, there was one glaring flaw to all of this. A couple days, then weeks passed, and things seemed like they were going smoothly, until John stopped showing up to class. After the first day of him not showing up, no one batted an eye. After the second day, then we started to get worried. So Dr. Talcum and the rest of us sent him some texts and emails to see what the deal was and if he was okay. No response at all. After the third day, we decided to just trust that he was okay and would show back up when he felt ready to. After the weekend, it was my day to check in on the worms, and something didn't sit right with me. Everything sounded a little too quiet, felt a little too calm, smelled too musty. And God, that smell was one of the worst things I'd ever smelled. Before opening the door, I could just feel that there was something rotting in there. I was just hoping it wasn't John. After what felt like forever at this point, I finally opened the door to see the most gruesome sight I could ever imagine. There was John, face down, with no semblance of life left in him, with the nastiest gash on his head. Along with him on the ground was the shelf that was holding the worms, with blood splattered along the corner of it. The screws were still stuck in it, and on the wall were the holes where the screws used to be. I continued to look and found dirt and mud flung everywhere, including on his shoes. I know that all of us had issues with mud being everywhere, even on the ground. Poor John must have not seen it and slipped on it. Trying to regain himself, he had to try and grab the shelf, only the shelf fell with him. As he landed on the ground, the shelf struck his forehead, killing him. I only wish for his sake that his death was instant. As a result, the containers were scattered along the ground with not a worm in sight. I wondered where the worms themselves were, and as if it was some sick, twisted joke, I found my answer. As I inspected John's corpse further, I noticed little shivers along his body. Only, it wasn't on his body. It was under his skin. Barely hidden by the small shakes under his skin were the countless holes that were spread along his body. Before I could even notice anything else in the nightmare I had laid before me, one thing became very clear about the worms. You remember how I said the original worms would have the flies fly out of the body of the host? Well, safe to say that these flies have at least that in common. Like clockwork, the fly freed itself from John, but then 2 more came, then 4, then 8. Eventually, I lost track in the number of them freeing themselves from John's lifeless body. A swarm of flies surrounding me as they buzzed around my head prevented me from noticing that they were leaving the room. Of course, the screaming of the other students filled the halls as all 246 recorded flies were let loose that night. As expected, the school contained a lot of them, but of course, it'd be impossible to contain them all. So far, there have been no reports of the flies taking a human host. Or, so we're told.
Divination is the practice of receiving unforeseen knowledge through means that cannot be explained by current scientific standards. For all of human history, cultures have always had a group of people dedicated to finding the truth through mystical methods. In some, diviners were seen as beings blessed by the gods to reveal truth, or omens, to the common worshippers. In others, these people were practitioners of dark arts, attempting to bring about the end of the world. There are hundreds of recorded methods for performing divination. In the pre-colonial Americas, multiple civilizations practiced divination using grains of corn. Scrying, use of a reflective surface to divinate, was a popular method in ancient Egypt, Greece, Aztec, and Mesopotamia cultures. Ancient Middle Eastern countries practiced geomancy, or or using the shapes of sand or stone to predict the future. Our focus is on ancient Rome, where divination was used on an empire-wide scale. Influenced by the Etruscans, Rome had a few methods that were practiced in times where an answer was required but could not be worked out. In two forms of divination, this searching for answers would require the life of an animal. Sometimes, if the situation was dire enough, a human sacrifice would be required. There are two categories of divination that practice with the use of sacrificial animals or people: Ecstasy and Herispecy. Ecstasy was the more official practice that was used for ceremonies. The diviner would begin right after the sacrifice has been made. They would cut the abdomen open to quickly inspect the entrails of the victim. They would make their predictions and omens based on the quality of the entrails and whether or not they witness anything that is abnormal within it. In some cases, if the insides of the victim contain too many abnormal pieces, the diviner would state that the sacrifice would not be accepted by the gods, and another must be performed. Herispecy, however, is a more thorough process. It also uses the organs of a sacrificial offering. However, their inspections were longer and more precise than that of Ecstasy. Usually, the Haruspex diviner, also known as the Haruspex, would take note of every anomaly within the inside, which would impact the omen he would relay. They would also focus intently on the liver, which was seen at the time as a source of life. While not as grand or public as the Ecstasy diviner, the Haruspex was still considered a very important role in revealing truth within the religion of Rome. So, why name ourselves after this grim choice of a subject? We will answer that shortly. However, we have one more story we would like to present for you tonight. We've all seen it. The Not Lighthouse that resides in the middle of campus that plays music at certain times and flashes pretty colors at different points during the year. The Beacon, as it is formally known, does not really serve any major purpose on campus, mostly acting as a symbol to the Virginia Wesleyan community. However, the Beacon was not always the Beacon. Before the Beacon came to be, in its place originally stood the Monumental Bell Tower. The bell tower was a staple to most people's exposure to campus life. It was a constant in their day-to-day. It could always be seen or heard anywhere on campus. Despite this, no one really ever knew the full reason why the reconstruction took place. There's the standard excuse of the foundation giving way, warranting some kind of adjustment. There's also the tale of a generous donor taking a walk around campus, seeing this monolith, and thinking, wow, that is one ugly building. I guess it's time to donate, and then proceeding to fund the entire project. But, based on the discoveries of a construction worker on site at the bell tower, we would soon find that darker motives could have been at play here. After an interview with John Carsing, the assistant foreman on the project, the revelation came that the chapel might not have always been the most welcoming place.
For starters, our head foreman had no idea what we were getting into. Being straight up, this seemed like the usual shit we deal with. Walk in, tear down the space, save a few pieces that people find pretty about it or whatever made it stand out, and throw up a new version of what serves the same purpose, but with a modern feel. Everybody likes a little touch-up here and there, especially new presidents trying to make a big impact. The main segment of the job took place during the kids' Christmas break anyway, so we do all that loud shit and then we do the quiet touch-ups when the kids come back. So first off comes the cross that topped it, and this was really the only piece that they specifically requested we save for them for whatever they wanted to use it for, which ended up being a topper for that lighthouse. Next came the section that holds the bell in place, which, big whoop-de-doo, had no real bell in there, only just a machine doing it. Makes the job easier? But it's still disappointing nonetheless. I kind of like finding old relic stuff like that. Then followed that portion of cement that sits right under where the bell would have been hanging and right above the supports from underneath. This is where maintenance could go to enter the bell tower to fix any issues in that place above, but can't imagine they would, seeing as there's no bell. Imagine our faces when we take off that slab, and there's a treasure chest in there. A whole fucking treasure chest. You'd think that would be one of the things you're told about from the start. It's positioned so weirdly, where it's hidden behind a wall attached to the slab, so if anyone accessed the space from the hole underneath, it would be hidden. One of the best parts of the gig is the weird shit we find on our sites. You'd be surprised by how many work finds I've been able to repurpose as room decor or Christmas gifts. Stuff ranging from fallout shelter signs to old books, sometimes even time capsules, but the list goes on. But a treasure chest? Call me a virgin. Usually we have protocol about what we can take and what we have to report to our boss and tell the clients. Lucky me, Greg owed me a favor. Since I didn't rat about the last site having a shell of that old motorcycle model that got him excited, he'd take care of me and let me take this chest home. Keeping my mouth shut got me the biggest treasure of them all, ironically. It didn't matter that I worked a 10-hour shift or that most of my day was spent doing the manual labor. As soon as I pulled up to my place, I immediately drove my truck to the back shed to get started on opening this thing up. This was the first time I was able to actually get a decent look at the chest since I threw it in the back of my pickup. And it didn't look like your cliche pirate chest or anything. In fact, it seemed a little bit more modern. With almost no decorations on it, it was mostly metal. It had some wooden pieces along the sides and the front, which makes some sense since the chest was so friggin' heavy. And holding the chest closed was this strangely large lock with a keyhole on the front plate. Based off the rust, there was a good amount of years stored up on that chest, which is strange because it had such a modern design. But the crowbar wouldn't cut it, and I couldn't fit any lockpicks into it, and WD-40 wasn't even helping. And so I finally end up getting out the hacksaw and praying to God that I didn't cut my fortune to ribbons trying to open this thing up. And I think starting that thing up and doing the cut was the longest 3 minutes of my life. So I'm about halfway through the cut on the lock in the front, when all of a sudden, the weight behind the lock gives, and the saw cuts straight through the lock and smack dab into the middle of the box. The Coast Guard wouldn't have been able to find my heart based on how far it had sank down when I saw this piece of white cloth caught onto one of the sawtooths. I just knew for certain, right there, I wasted an entire night's worth of work. How wrong was I? I pull the saw out of the box and I put it down as gently as possible, not trying to rip apart the contents of the box any more than I already had. Since the lock is off, I begin to take its pieces off the chest. In my head, I don't know what to expect. With that piece of cloth that was slightly ripped and showing, I expected to find something delicate or precious wrapped up in the white cloth. The last thing I would have ever expected to see when I opened up that box would have been a jar of rotten teeth. I closed that shit up as fast as I could, and I got up for a walk. I had to step outside for a smoke after seeing that. Teeth? Did I really just see teeth? My initial curiosity was killed after seeing the jar, and after 2 cigarettes, I just went straight to bed in some futile attempt to sleep that night. What explainable reason would there be for a chest like this to be at the top of a college bell tower? Why wouldn't anyone know about this? And if anyone did know, why would they let us find this? These questions just kept popping up in my head as we worked the next day, and I was absolutely exhausted. I don't know if it was because of the hours I spent working on the chest that night, the 2 hours of sleep I ended up getting, or both. I pushed through most of the day, doing the bare minimum I could to stay productive, but I rested whenever I had the chance. Greg tried to hit me up about the box, but luckily he was called over to ask about layouts and things like that before I ever had to answer. Work ended that day and I still didn't know what to do. There's a chest in my shed with teeth in it. What am I supposed to do with that? Call the police? On my own shed? I don't want to be the one explaining that. But I still can't get over the contents. Looking inside of it, the jar was sitting right on top of the cloth, and I felt like there had to be more underneath. There might be a reasonable explanation as to why the teeth are in there. It's a college after all. It could be scientific or some kind of research thing. But still, why the hell was it in the bell tower? I didn't want to see the teeth again, but for my sanity and figuring out what to do next, I needed to see the rest of the box. So I was ready to go through the rest of the contents that night. I got 2 packs of cigarettes, a pack of Red Bull, a new carpenter's mask, and some brand new gloves. If this took all night, so be it. I was getting through all of the contents of that chest and finding out what secrets it held. So I reopened the box, and the first thing I did was grab the jar and set it to the side. I'd come back to that, but I didn't need to be this nauseous in the beginning. All that stood between me and the rest of that chest was this torn white cloth. But it wasn't just a random white cloth. After looking at it closer, what I thought was just some packing material turned out to be a robe, and in the center of it was a black cross with a hammer and a spike crisscrossed underneath it. I had never seen this kind of symbol before. Except for the tear that I created, the robe itself seemed to be in pristine condition. I lifted it and set it beside the jar, and I was right. There were definitely more things under that robe. There were articles of clothing, books, boxes, pictures of groups of people, and then a hammer and a chisel. A couple other odds and ends, but a lot of these things ended up having the same exact symbol on it. I ended up finding a large black book with golden pages with the cross, hammer, and spike outlined in white. I opened up the front cover and it had these inscriptions. The Holy Fire Society, Order 1099, and the phrase Vince in bono malum?
The Holy Fire Society, also known as the Flamer Corps by those on campus, was a popular social club that officially resided at the school from 1972 to 1989. It was an exclusive club, having generally 20 to 40 members each year, and a roster total of 187 members. Its requirements for entry were never publicly known, but its members typically fit a general description, a background and affiliation with Christianity. It was unknown as to why the organization disappeared. To the campus, they were a good group who led church services and helped the community around them. Most of the members were active in their communities, usually being the leaders in most of their departments. Some members even went on from college to create huge non-profit organizations, become CEOs at big businesses, and even make innovative strides in the scientific and political fields. With a group of men and women such as these, what reason would there be for an organization of this magnitude to not remain on campus, let alone be remembered?
I don't know what to make of the text provided within the actual book. A lot of it seemed like your stereotypical society stuff, such as budgets and bylaws and so on and so forth. There were a lot of religious references made in the book, though, even using the Bible within a few of their ceremonies. However, there were 2 main sections that kind of made me physically ill as I read them. The first section of the book was discussing some of the rituals they would do for their meetings. And a lot seemed like symbolism, but there were some key phrases that suggested something else. Like their initiation section, where there's a part where the prospective member's hand is physically restrained and they must suffer the blow of the nail to the palm, just like our Lord suffered innumerable. And there were other sections like this, where people would do these violent actions and scenarios because God did it first. The worst, however, was the ledger section at the end. There were all these different dates and entries, and once I looked closer at it, that's when I realized that these weren't symbolism. Things started to line up. All these entries discussed times and members that had done outreach opportunities. Acts of community service were the most common, but what was strange were the events in between those. And after looking through the rest of the box, it was easy to connect the dots. In the bottom of the box were 2 sets of undergarments. A man's boxers and a woman's underwear. Both sets appeared to be bloodied and torn. There's only one ledger that I could find to match this description. Give me a moment here. I took some notes. 10/17/84. Witnessed member Gibbs with an unequally yoked relationship near the lake. Both were chastised accordingly after bringing them directly to trial. Gibbs joined Order Eternal. And then another item I found was this pair of cracked glasses, and I couldn't pinpoint exactly which entry coincides with this item, but there are 2 that could fit. One second. 3/9/85. Non-believers seen with crystals and other pagan paraphernalia on their person. Discussion occurred but could not see the light. Chastised accordingly. Or 4/22/81. Believer reading anti-religious texts during the time of worship. Called to meeting after service, but claimed they had to read during. Chastised accordingly. The biggest thing I found were 17 different entries referring to extraction for transgressions from non-believers. That is the exact number of teeth within the jar. I pushed the thought to the back of my mind and tried to spend the rest of the night digging through the book and matching up these items and entries. And I managed to find 30 items that had a matching entry, but 10 of them didn't have an entry and 50 entries didn't have any items. And honestly, I don't know if these people lived through these experiences. I started to do some searching online out of just morbid curiosity, and I found the obituaries of multiple members from the ledgers. And based on the entries of said members, the dates match the timeline of their deaths. But all these official causes were suicides. Gibbs, the horny teen who got caught, his real name was Clarence, and he was found the next day on the beach dead from a drug overdose. And the other non-members? They're near impossible to track. There are no names in the entries. There's only been one that I have a potential lead on, and it's 2/19/81. Non-believer found near baptismal water under the influence. Was baptized for her transgressions and chastised accordingly. Tara Sarguccio, a sophomore at the time, was found a week later floating in the lake, and her death was also ruled an accident. Apparently, she fell into the water by herself and couldn't make it back to the shore. I can't tell if it's a targeted effort of a hate group, the fierce passion of a cult, the dreadful presence of religion, or all of them. The only thing I know for sure is that some of the names of the school administrators and donors are pretty similar to the names on the member list.
Why is our project called Haruspex? First of all, it is not because we want to look at dead animals all day. That is gross, and we want nothing to do with it. We chose the name Haruspex for 2 reasons. Number 1 being that we thought the name was very cool and original. Number 2 is that we saw our project as a metaphorical version of the Herispecy process. While the history you have learned from the people around you is similar to the acts of Ecstasy. Whether you heard it from your professors or other students, the histories, stories, and rumors you have heard from your time here are all surface level. You pass by these buildings and you are told these tales, but you are never given anything more than that. They aren't first-hand experiences. They aren't backed up by evidence or witnesses. They are stories that have so far only been told and been accepted. Have they changed over time? What if these stories are just seniors scaring younger freshmen? Or just myths turned truth? However, we aim to change that. We look to go beyond the surface level, to dig out these true stories by finding the evidence and people who can support them. We want you to know what has happened around you, what tales the bricks around you truly tell. We want everything to be out in the open, where there are no more hidden anomalies that have to be dug up. We aim to find the abnormalities for all to see. You might ask yourself if we are telling the truth. In the sincerest way that I can put it, that's for you to decide. Thank you for joining us tonight. We hope that you took these stories to heart and that you will tune in the next time we present our findings again. If you enjoyed this program and want to listen to more, here's a little hint on how to find our next installment. Near the end of October, be on the lookout for a QR code with our name on it. You might see it as you're scrolling online, or you could see it on your way to class. Any way you find it, make sure to scan it. There should be a little surprise waiting behind there.
Haruspex is a Marlin Broadcasting Network production. Written by Robert Jones and Jackson Simmons. Produced by Cole Cassidy and Jackson Simmons. Narrations used in Haruspex provided by Alea Johnson, Jackson Simmons, Angelica Walker, Robert Jones, and Cole Cassidy. Background vocals provided by Andrew Taylor and Catherine Needswicki.
Music excerpts provided by Serena Smith, Lily J., A.M., and Jackson Simmons.
Special thanks to Travis Malone, Trey Delpo, and Jason Squinaball.